Welcome to With You Podcast.
where we explore relationships and life transitions.
I'm David.
And I'm Tara. And I know you want to ask me how I'm feeling.
I so want to ask you how you're feeling, but it seems a little cliche, especially today.
We're talking about feelings.
We're talking about emotions.
Emotions, yes.
And I think we're going to learn emotions and feelings are different things.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
You love to talk about emotions.
I do. I love to talk about relationships.
That's true.
Yeah. So
And feelings are a big part of that.
they are. I mean, people often think my standard is, so how do you feel about that? And that doesn't concern me.
No, what does concern
which
you?
is a strange thing. I mean, how are you doing? I think is more of what I say to you.
Is that different?
I think it
Then
is.
how are you feeling?
Yeah.
How are you doing?
I think we're gonna talk to our expert about that, and because doing is an action, I think we tend to think of feelings as an internal state.
Yeah, well, and that's what we're going to talk about with somebody who really
Someone
has.
that knows.
She's really written a lot and thought a lot and
Yeah.
studied a lot about this. So this is one of these cases where, originally we heard her on a podcast speaking about the cultural differences in emotions, and it made so much sense.
Yep.
And you think, gosh, we would love to just have dinner with her.
Yeah, sit around the
Like-
table, have a conversation. It sounded delightful.
Right. She just is the kind of person that I think we'd have such a rich conversation with. And we had so many things that we wanted to go deeper on with her. But she lives in Belgium.
Yeah.
So,
Well, we could have had maybe both of us made the same meal, and through a Zoom we could have had meal together. And
we should have thought of that.
yeah, I just came up with that.
Yeah. In any case, you invited her to come
I
talk
did.
to us on the podcast, and she said yes. And we can't believe it. And we're so excited.
Yeah.
So excited to talk to her. So I'll just tell you who we're talking about.
Yes, tell us about her.
So her name is Dr. Batja Mesquita. And she's Dutch originally,
Which is a bonus point.
which is part of what's exciting for you
Yeah,
because
that's
some
right.
shared cultural heritage. But she now kind of has just a lot of qualifications in the domain of studying the cultural differences in emotions.
Mhm.
And I mean, we'll post her bio if you want to links to where she studies and what she has written.
Yep.
That'll be in our podcast show notes. But let me just tell you kind of the highlights about her. She's a social psychologist, an affective scientist, and a pioneer of cultural psychology. She studied a lot of things. She's a professor of psychology at the University of Leuven in Belgium. And just, lots of things.
Yeah,
Lots
one of my favorite things though is she loves family systems theory and really gets it.
Yeah.
And so for a social psychologist and about emotions and about relationships, it's amazing. And
Yeah.
because she was a professor and went to school in the U.S. She was at the University of Michigan, Stanford,
Yeah.
the University of Amsterdam. I know that's not in the U.S., that's in the Netherlands. But she's prolific in her research, and it's global.
Right. And she's crossed cultures. And I think that is what's highlighted this work for her because she came from the Netherlands, I think, to Michigan to study and found that her way of being with her friends, her American friends, was just different. And she tells a lot of these stories of these cultural sort of missteps in her book and how that drove her to think even more deeply about how we think differently about emotions, even if we use the same words for them.
Right.
Culturally, the way we express and understand emotion can be completely different, which at first glance feels like, oh no, I thought that was the one thing all humans had in common. And yet it's also like an invitation to go, okay, so we all have shared kind of characteristics as humans, but if we explore more about how that looks different for each of us, it's an invitation to connect.
Yeah, and it'll help. I mean, I think even us, we're both born and raised here in the U.S. mostly, but our family cultures are different. And those things can lead to relational tension and problems. So it can be within your marriage or within your significant relationships, as well as cross-culturally
Right.
challenging.
Yeah, and even emotions talk differently between genders and across regions and just in lots of ways.
Yeah. I think you'll be as excited as we were to hear from Batja.
Yes, I know they will. So we're going to welcome her to talk more deeply, specifically about her book, Between Us: How Cultures Create Emotion. We have
And
a lot of
and it's
questions.
between us.
It is between us. Yeah, if you're looking on YouTube, it's a well-read book for us. We really enjoyed, kind of diving deep, and so we're gonna ask for some clarifications maybe and
Yep.
some
Stories.
stories. And so we are pleased and excited and honored to welcome Batja Mesquita. All right, so we're so happy to welcome you, Batja. We're so glad that you agreed to spend some time with us and talk about your work and talk about your book that's been so interesting to us. And we loved reading it. We discovered you by hearing you talk about your book on another podcast, and we thought we wanted our turn to ask you our questions. And we thought it fit so well with, we come from a systemic therapy worldview, and it fits in so well with that. And we had a lot more we wanted to know. And you
Yeah.
can tell her where you're coming from.
I got so excited because I'm a professor of marriage and family therapy, and your presentation was so systemic, and it just did my heart well because in the psychology world, it tends to be this more intrinsic, what's happening in the individual and not between people. So, and another thing, Wheaton College, the place where I teach, the theology department uses your book in a class called God and Emotion. And they cover psychology, neuroscience, and anthropology views of human identity, kind of explicit, implicit ways of thinking about emotion, understanding our relationship with God, each other, and ourselves. So that's a little bit of what my context is that got me really excited about your book.
Yeah. And so you know where I'm coming from. I'm a birth doula. So all my work with people, we're in high states of emotion usually.
Yes.
And
we got good sampling going on there. Yeah.
yes, a really good sampling of all sorts of families from all sorts of cultures. So my context, I found your work really interesting in that context too. So just so that all of our listeners are on the same page, we are fully aware of all the stuff in your book, but we'd love you to just kind of explain your work a little bit and what you did in this book.
Ooh, that's a broad question to start off. But I think what I try to do in this book is turn the perspective inside out. So I think that, we Western people at least think of emotions as, oh, where would they be? In the heart, in the head? I think most modern people would say in the head, but certainly within an individual, they're kind of essences, meaning that they're always kind of the same. They have to come inside out. You look inside. If you want to know something about your emotions, you definitely look inside and focus on what's going on within you. And the more I did research and the more I thought about emotions, the more I thought that it actually a big part of what emotions are or come to be lies outside the person, is in their relationship. And what I say in the book is, if you want to understand your emotions, you have to follow them outside in. Where did they come from? What do they do in the relationship? How were you raised? What are your values? What are the values in your culture? So all these things that are really outside of a person or shared with other people. And in many, and then, there are different parts of the book, but I think that's the main thesis of the book. Let's see what we can learn about emotions when we don't just stay with the individual, but when we look at how the individual is embedded in their interactions, their relationships, their groups, their identities, and their religions, if you want, and their cultures. Not and those things are overlapping, of course, but
I love that you talk about weird cultures because I've been called weird for a lot of different reasons. And this is the first time where it's like, oh, it's a social location. And
yeah.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about weird and non-weird cultures, because we'll talk about that later on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Weird cultures is actually we don't usually think weird cultures are Western cultures. To be very short, it's not a word that I invented, but the words that people in 2010, an article was published that said, is psychology weird? And it stands for Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic countries. And
Yeah.
you can see countries or cultural context, because even if you look within the US, of course, not everybody is educated and rich. And what the article was about is that a lot of the psychological research is done with highly educated, sometimes exclusively white, a lot of college students, but if not college students, then highly educated Western, people from the US and Western Europe, and usually actually white. And so it shows that on a number of emotional processes, when we look at this group, this weird group, they are the odd ones out. Actually, the rest of the world is very different on cognition, emotion, ideas of self, identity. And so what you can say is that we have been studying these processes in a very exclusive environment, and
Mm.
we can't really generalize. That's the idea of the book. And so weird is not, what is weird, but it's a good, I think what the concept has done, it was like 20 years into 20 or 30 years actually into the existence or the birth of cultural psychology as we know it now. But it's been a very powerful instrument to make people aware that what we know about psychology, what we know about the mind, is so so contained, really.
Yeah.
Nothing about, I mean, we're starting to know more about the rest of the world, but everything we think is true isn't even true for the people who are less educated in the US. So
And,
that's
and
weird.
I like that because you're talking about moving decentering from the Western perspective, which does the heavy lifting in terms of historical research, to this is the odd thing. Globally, there's this other perspective, and you talk about that in terms of mine and ours.
Yeah, and that's one of your core concepts you talk about a lot in the book. So we thought we'd just throw out that definition of mine and ours too, because I'm sure we'll refer to that. And you say it so well in the book, but mine being mostly the Western culture way of looking at emotions, coming from the M as mental, inside the person, and essentialist, kind of always having the same properties, right? The mine
Mhm.
view, and then the ours view of emotions being more outside the person, happening in a relational context, and situated, meaning it can take different shapes
Mhm.
depending on what's going on. So that view even challenges us a lot as Americans, because when we do talk about feelings, often what we're saying is we're going inside to explore and find them, and bring them to the outside. And
Right.
this ours view is a very different view of them occurring and even being created in a relationship.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I say two things in the book. I say there's a big difference in the cultural emphasis on each of those aspects.
Hmm.
On the other hand, emotions everywhere have some kind of internal quality or mental quality, and emotions everywhere have a relational quality.
Yeah.
It's just that in the West, we're not. I mean, if I ask you about it, what if you're angry? Is that something that affects your relationship with the person you're angry at? I mean, of course it is.
Yeah.
Often the whole reason of being angry is that you want that relationship to change. So it's not that we don't have an ours aspect of relation of emotions, but it's just that if we think about what they really are, then we think they're inside.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. So there's some, the emotion, the beast themselves, given that they're psychological processes, our way of thinking about them affects them. So it's not that, they become different kind of beasts, so to say, when you think you can't change them, they have to get out, they're inside yourself. Or when you think, oh, this is something that's going on between people and they're always accommodating relationship or always having emotions, together with other people. That's a very different way of looking at it. But yeah, it's not to say that that our emotions are really all mine.
Yeah.
Because I think that even, and that's also what I say in the book, following your emotions outside in is actually a really good strategy. It's a way of understanding more about your emotions, also for Westerners. And we miss a whole part of emotions if we don't realize. And this is, of course, where the systemic approach is. It's a natural home for this theory. It was one of the first general talks that I gave was to the System Therapy Institute in Belgium. I published a book. So it's a natural, and I've had podcasts with system therapy because it fits within this idea that emotions are certainly relational and that they're always part of a relational configuration.
I love how you say it's a natural home for this idea. It really is. And I know you want to ask some family related questions.
We're trying to balance out, but I want to just selfishly take all the time. So it's testing our relationship
That's
and
right.
emotions. But I do think that systemic idea, because we talk about symptoms as a function of relationship rather than intrinsically in the individual, and emotions seem to be a good fit there. Besides therapy, one of my favorite hobbies is family history and thinking about the impact of relationship and emotion on family. I know you spent some time in University of Michigan. I wondered if you ran into any Western Michigan Dutch Americans while you were in Michigan.
I don't know, actually. This is probably a detour, but I do remember it was in the early 90s, and I do remember going to the main square and seeing all these shops, and I just had to make myself aware that I was in the US because they were all Dutch names.
Yeah.
Or owners were Dutch, were Dutch heritage, but I don't know if I know many people who are from Dutch origin, actually. I mean, Ann Arbor is a very much a university city, town.
Yeah, if you ever got to the western part of Michigan, Grand Rapids, Holland, Grand Haven, that's where my people came from, Groningen. And settled there in the 1850s, 1880s. And so I think of myself as Dutch, but then when I speak in University of Utrecht and other places in the Netherlands, I realize I am not Dutch. And so this idea of our heritage and kind of being imprinted by culture and yet being transplanted or being an immigrant kind of really hits personally, because I think about my family legacy, and it's we love by doing. The idea of praise is overrated. Like, that's just what you should do. And anytime anybody praises you, they either don't know you or you shouldn't trust them.
Right.
And so I think some of those things are legacies of my cultural background.
Yeah, I think so too. And you know what? It's interesting. Cultures, of course, change. So your ancestors, whatever generation they came from the Netherlands at that time.
Yeah.
And so I have this cousin who learned Dutch from my aunt and uncle, but they moved in the 60s. His Dutch is really good, but I only found out he was a modern person when we started speaking English.
Yeah.
Because it was archaic. And I think it's like that with culture. I mean, of course, cultures can develop in different directions.
Yeah.
And I recognize don't say, I mean, I write that in the book, right? My mom said, act normal. That's special stuff or something. she would say I was average, and I
Yeah.
just think don't get too many ideas about yourself. That's not good. So there is a core that, at least when I was raised, which is also a while ago, but it
Yeah,
still will be there. But
it feels like the culture gets reified or gets kind of set in terms of when the immigration happened. So I feel connected to like the 19th century Dutch culture more
yeah,
than contemporary. And I liked how you talked about it takes almost on average 3 generations to really acculturate. And I was wondering if you could talk about that and the literature around that a little bit, because that's my life.
right. Which generation are you, by the way?
I'm
Third?
third. Yes.
Okay.
Well,
Yeah.
and that's just to add on, that was some of the students in this class at the college asked to kind of contribute some questions. And a lot of them, I mean, in America, we have so many people that are living multiculturally. And
Yeah.
so that was a lot of their questions too, is what if I've got a foot in one culture and a foot in another culture, and I'm straddling mine and ours sort of ways of looking at emotions. And that's the experience for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, I think, I would say this is, what for a long time, psychologists were not interested in acculturation of emotions because they thought of them as unchangeable and basic and natural. So you have to have the starting point that there is something different with emotions in order to become interested in acculturation. And so that was my path. And emotional acculturation is really something that we've been studying maybe for the last 10, 15 years.
Mm.
And there are some things we know, but there are also many things we don't know. But we do think, well, first of all, when you just look at if people give their emotional responses to a particular type of situation, how similar or different are those emotional responses from the profile that we find with majority members? And we've actually done this research with different kind of migrant groups in Belgium, but also with Korean groups, first and second generation in the US. So we've done different, and we're doing research now in this is the colleague who drinks coffee in the morning, but doing research now with Hispanic or Latino immigrants in California, and Moroccan and Turkish immigrants to Belgium. And so we're trying to see also how do the different contexts affect that process. And what happens when, I couldn't tell you myself, I'm probably bicultural American Western Europe, and it's not
Yeah.
completely the same, I can tell you. It's
Yeah.
they're close cultures, of course, but I still have something of a transition to make when I go from one coast to the next. Um, and and I wouldn't know how I do it myself. There is do we become mixes? Are some of is the interaction partner, that there is some evidence we have that people switch a little bit when there's a different interaction partner, or when there is a different when they speak a different language, is the ways in which we've tried to do it.
Yeah.
But how do we know? Because they're less similar to the pattern of the majority, or more similar to the pattern
Mm.
of the minority. But it's also really hard to measure. So we're thinking that it's a little bit of both. That when we look at those patterns of experience, we find that first and second generation immigrants are between the majority and majority culture, or the culture of the host culture, whatever you want to call that, and their culture of heritage in emotional experiences within a particular kind of situation. So the situations are comparable. And then we also see that there is some frame switching, in the sense that when minority people are at home with their family, and we know that this in Belgium specifically, but this is often, family is often still minority. There's not a lot of intermarriage. So family means that you're back with Turkish or Moroccan people. They're more like Turkish people, and when they're at work, they're more like the Belgian majority. And so that makes sense. We also find that the second generation is actually shifts more to the majority in the work context. The first generation shifts more to the heritage culture in the family context. So it's really complex and many things to measure. And of course, we're reducing this reality of life,
Right.
things that we can measure, and and it's incomplete. But yes, the other way of responding to this is, if emotions are something that you do with other cultures, that with other people, and in context of a culture, then starting to do it with multiple people from multiple cultures probably increases the range of your emotion repertoire.
Yeah.
And and makes you grow.
Right,
Um,
which is one of the reasons we love to travel, because we're learning more and more. It's not just about the language and the food and the architecture looking different. There's so much more to learn about the way people interact. And you did say in the book that when you were living, particularly in North Carolina, you learned to kind of shed, I think you used the word shed, some emotions to sort of fit the context. And I think maybe that's part of the way people start to adapt, is like, oh, I see that this isn't appropriate here, and I'm sort of learning the emotional language, and then it starts to become more of your reality.
yeah. Yeah. And I think what you're saying is really important. I would say you shed it not because um, you respond to some external norm. I mean, that's maybe how you started, like, oh, this didn't
Yeah.
sit very well. But you do emotions in part to reach other people.
Mhm.
And when the emotions you have don't reach people in the way you intended to, you start adjusting, because having emotions is really doing a relationship. So you start adjusting the emotion or the view to what does work in that relationship. And so when people don't respond, I mean, one of the examples that I give in the book is that Dutch people are very blunt, very straightforward, and sort of, it's interesting. There is no embellishment of, and there is an idea that you should know what I think.
Very efficient.
Very well, efficient when that's the norm, but
Yeah.
inefficient, I've noticed, when people just look the other way and think that clearly think that that's inappropriate, and and so
Yes.
I give several examples of where it was actually not effective at all. And so you start to, yeah, I mean, I don't think I've become a completely different a person. I think I'm still on the blunt side when, when I'm in a US context. But I am sometimes, I mean, I am, I sometimes am shocked by the bluntness of Dutch people. Like, oh Lord, did we need to say that? So it really shifted. Like,
Yeah, that's one of the quotes I highlighted in the book. Was, you said, no person is too old to learn from experience, but no person gets to erase their past either. So we always still carry that with us. And I know you want to ask some more personal questions about your own family impact.
Yeah, I was wondering if I could ask, kind of, because I think about multi-generational, how my Dutch immigrants to the US have an impact on me, even in terms of what I study, family dynamics and relationship. And so thinking about you seeing emotions relationally, it led me to do a little bit of research and found out your dad, Albert, was classmates with Anna Frank, and that he was in hiding. The same thing from the school that they went to for a little bit before they had to go 14
yeah.
different places to survive, and that he did. I just wonder how that emotions about fear and survival, what echoes have been in you and in your research from that.
Yeah. Before answering the question, my mom was also in hiding, so I have the double. And there was a book written about her, which is called "The Cutout Girl." So she wasn't together. She wasn't classmates with a famous with a famous author, but she had her own book written. Yeah. So you never. Uh, you never really know, of course. We're unaware of those influences. But um, I think I spent a life figuring out what people felt, because the feelings that they had were not really rooted in the environment that I was growing up in. I mean, I was a post-war child in a middle-class family, in a thriving democracy.
Yeah.
So I didn't have I knew, of course, that my grandparents on my mother's side, my mom was an orphan after the war, and so I knew I'd lost a lot of family, but that was not a loss that happened in my life. And
Mhm.
I also don't feel. I mean, I sometimes wonder what it would have been like if I had known my grandparents or my big family on both sides. Of course you do, but it's not a pain or a loss. I had
Right.
the people that I grew up with. So I think it made me take a perspective of somebody else's experiences, and made me maybe understand. You never know, of course. I mean, I was also always a psychologically minded kid, so I was nosy. I wanted to know why my mom felt like this and why my dad did like this. And I don't know that my brothers, for example, had the same experience, at least not when they were growing up. My brothers knew much less. So
Yeah.
it's always an interaction. But I think that for me, it was also the oldest child. For me, there was a curiosity about things that I didn't really understand, and that I would ask my mom why she was crying, or why she was. My mom had a period where she was very depressed, and I asked her why she was lying on the couch. And so there has been. I've been confronted with emotions that needed a perspective, that weren't directly readable for me, and that needed
Yeah.
another perspective to become more understandable.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, in part what you do when you interact with people from other cultures. It's not that you resonate with, not immediately. You don't have those emotions. You can't be empathetic and think, what would I feel in that situation, and understand why they responded that way. But you need a little more perspective. You need to know what was happening, what is important, what what was what was at stake, I would say.
Yeah.
And so you need to know more of their context and their situations and their frame of meaning. And so I mean, in a way, that's what I grew up doing, and that's what I kept doing. It sounds very boring. I've done this
Not at
my
all.
life.
I think one of the things that touched Tara and I, as we talked about your book and as we went through it, like we showed you early on, we spent a lot of time. One of us is yellow and one of us is purple, and we just kind of left notes to each other. But your focus and relational stance of curiosity, humility, of not taking and knowing, like, oh, this is whether it's mom, dad, someone from Turkey, of this is their experience, that essentialism, but you have this curiosity that's quite infectious, and humility. I think you're seeing some really interesting things, and you don't take yourself too seriously, at least in the writing. And from
No,
our playful time together, I
yeah,
think that's true. Um,
yeah. No, I don't. I don't. Well, I don't take myself too seriously in general, but I certainly don't take myself too seriously in that I can know what another person feels, and if that is a right way of feeling or expressing or regulating. Um, and I would say, if I have a criticism on the field, is that many. Let me talk for my own discipline. Many psychologists. Um, pretend they know. And I think that's very, you can know I'm all for collecting data, but I'm also all for being very modest about what those data mean and for whom. And so I think a lot of the knowledge that we have and transport to other cultures is really made in the West. So, for example, we're doing this research on Japanese couples, Japanese and Belgian couples, actually. And our first research was about conflict interactions, and we observed them, and we also asked them, what do you think is an ideal way to deal with a conflict? And we find that Belgian couples think that it's necessary to have conflict once in a while. It's healthy for the couple. It's a learning curve that you have when you have conflict, and when of course, you shouldn't be aggressive, but expressing your dismay and your needs, and that's really important. And the Japanese say no. You should avoid conflict. It's not necessary at all, maybe with some very small exceptions, like, if you can't spend the same money twice. So if you disagree on where to spend the money, you might have to address it. And we also see that they have very different emotions when they have these interactions on disagreements. And then the Belgians, and they try to understand each other. They try to anticipate what the other's needs are. And so it's a very different system, if you will, in where the Belgians defend their own needs, and the Japanese, if anything, protect the needs of the other and are protecting the relationship in any time. And so the reported emotions are also very different.
Yeah.
And so I think that a lot of the therapy world is still based on the idea that conflict is healthy and unavoidable. And that if you and even I describe in the book an example of where a friend of mine, it's been many years, I think the child they adopted must be 35 or so now, but at the time, I know this was still in the Netherlands, so social work, the juvenile protection came by to see if they were suitable for adoption, and they asked them, do you have conflict? And my friend was from Chinese heritage, and they just didn't have very much conflict. And they said, no, we actually don't have much conflict. And the social worker was very sure that that wasn't a good marriage. They didn't. They suppressed their conflicts. They knew for sure that that was an unhealthy relationship.
Uh-oh, we're in trouble.
Yeah. So this is an example where I think, how does it work? Can you explain me how your relationship work? How do you get around to the things that you see differently? What do you do for each other? What are your ways of connecting, or when you feel that the connection doesn't work, what are you doing? So yes, I think we should be humble as, I don't know if I'm a humble person, but I try to be, and I try to not take, but certainly as a field and as a profession, I think that we need to be very humble about what we think we know. And we need to take one of the things that I learned in my cross-cultural research career is, when the data don't work as you think they should, take the participants seriously.
Yeah.
And that's, that was a really hard lesson for me to learn, because, like anybody, what I learned in school, that was what I thought was true.
Yeah.
And those
I think
Japanese.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to
No,
interrupt you, but I think that is the biggest, most important concept in your whole book, is that perspective. I love highlighting things. So just reading from your own words again, you said, I hope you understand that we can neither directly read emotions from other people's faces, nor simply catch the emotions of other people. Just imagining how you would feel in a similar situation will not do the job. If you tried, you would almost certainly make sense of a given situation in a way that fits your culture's values and relationship goals. And I think that is what you were just saying, that we all have to understand we're coming in with our own lens, our own glasses that we're seeing things through. And the first thing is learning to see through those or around those, or asking questions of other people and realizing that we've already got our own set of understanding that we're asking questions from even. And that was the hardest thing reading the book, is just realizing how much I'm really entrenched in my internal understanding of emotions. And this new understanding can shift the sands a little bit, because I think as humans, we understand that when we go to a different country, the language is going to sound different, the food's going to taste different. But to think our emotions could be completely understood different, it shifts the ground under us a little bit, because we think, then what is our common thing that happens in humanity? What is the same? And you do talk about that, the experiences, the things we want from
Yeah.
relationships.
Yeah. I think, we don't want exactly the same, but of course we are human beings, and our emotions are always about things that we value, or things that happen and that we value, or things that happen that interfere with our values or our goals. Now, what those values and goals are is very different. And we don't like, we want relationships. We don't want to be lonely. That's
Mhm.
that's universal. But what it takes to have those relationships, or how you do those relationships, is different. What is valued in those relationships is different. So in those senses, some emotions fit the relationships of some cultures better than the relationships of other cultures. So that's very different. What we do with our emotions is also very, very different, depending on but we are human beings. And I think really understanding each other's emotions in terms of the conditions of humanity, of we need to live in groups that have certain values. We want to have relationships. We want the best for the people who are close to us. We also don't want to be excluded from the group, right? That's one of the so
Mhm.
we want to be sure that we're safe, and status of some kind can be a signal that you're safe. It's not you can be okay also with a lower status, as long as you know that the people with the higher status accept you and protect you.
Mhm.
So there are differences in what it takes to have status. Um, so it's not. I wouldn't say that you cannot understand anything about the emotions of other people. You can understand them as responses to human conditions, and to but you can't immediately uh instantiate what their
Yeah.
value goals are, or how what they consider good relationship. That you can't.
Yeah, and I think it distills it down so beautifully then. We all want to be in relationship. We all want to be cared for and care for somebody else. And then we can just be curious about the how is different for all of us, which only strengthens our connection.
Yeah,
I-
I think approaching it that way strengthens that connection. Yeah.
and finding a goodness of fit rather than there's a specific outcome of what's the goodness of fit for the
Right.
combined parts that show up.
That's a very nice way of saying, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
your emotions fit into the society or the relationships that you live in. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
and having to find a new balance when situations change, when cultures change. I'm
yeah.
curious for you, how did all of this? So, for me, studying marriage and family therapy really made our relationship, our marriage, hard because I would practice on Tara, and had to learn. Oh no, I need to be David and not a marriage and family therapist in our marriage. I'm curious how this research and this field of study has affected your relationships, parenting, good, bad, indifferent, of like what has happened studying emotions with all of your emotions and family dynamics.
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, there's a lot of articulation of
Mm.
what I feel, why I feel it, but I can't say that see, my context is still my context.
Yeah.
So I can't say, I can say that I have, as a teenager, I was very rebellious against tradition and family, in a very in a way that I think fit my generation. I just didn't want to have anything to do with formality and with structure and rituals, and there was a lot of it in my family. And of course, people held on to it because that was the Jewish culture that was left, and I didn't want anything to do with it. And there are multiple reasons, and I think I've come to appreciate, and that's probably an effect of aging, but also an effect of having seen alternative ways of making relationships. I also see the values of doing some of it. So I am probably a little more, not a little more ritualistic with my kids, not in the religious sense, but we have I'm lucky enough that my adult kids live in the same town as I do. But so we have family dinners once or twice a week, and we do have, Easter egg hunts still for my almost 30-year-old kids. I organize that. And I hide the chocolate eggs. And I think we do birthdays. I think some of that is a reappreciation of what it does give you to be in a more relational system, in a less individual system where every time the choices have to be made anew. But as I say, that may also be something that happens with people over age in general, that you appreciate a little more
Yeah.
what the value is of a family when you have to make sure that your own kids stay close rather than staying out yourself with your parents.
That's right.
So I would say I have different registers of emotions. And of course, you better understand that it's possible to have these emotions, to value these emotions that are completely different from the ones that you grew up with. And there's maybe a little, that's maybe another effect, that there's a little less idea that an emotion is natural, that it naturally comes up. There's a little more awareness of that an emotion has everything to do with how you construct the situation and what you emphasize in it. But that, yeah, so I mean, it's very hard to say what did my studies, what did my research do with me? Because that's me.
Because you're in that context already. I imagine your kids then are pretty good at articulating emotions too, because that's the context they grew up in.
Yeah, I mean, I think yeah, it's certainly a family where we talk about emotions. Yeah, I have no comparison.
Yeah, it's hard for you to see it when that's
Yeah.
what you're in, but we're just imagining from the outside that you're probably creating a new trajectory in your family line where, your kids are probably more comfortable with talking about emotions in a certain way, and that sort of gets passed along into their contexts as well. And that's the sort of systemic influence, the mutual influence that we all have.
Yeah, although we're not constantly talking about emotions, of course. And one of the things that I've realized is that I would say I've come from this introspective, in my teens, there was this culture of introspection and talking about your emotion and making sure that you know what you feel. And if anything, I think that, that's not pan-cultural, that a lot of cultures don't maybe use the vocabulary of emotions as much, but use other vocabularies, the vocabulary of relationships, the vocabulary of bodies.
And action. You said even in the language chapter, you said some cultures don't even have a word for emotion, the emotion
for the
word.
emotion category. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I don't know that I talk that much about emotions. But I do think that there is, I mean, I have a fine appreciation of different kinds of relationships, of
Mm.
how people are getting along, what happens in relationships. But I don't know that, I don't know that I'm constantly asking my kids how they're feeling. I mean, I do ask them how they're doing, but it's not like we're not
No, you do it. You
Yeah.
do it. You don't need to describe it. Yeah.
hyper.
And we love that part about language. We get really interested in how language shapes a lot about the way we see the world, and just the words we use that organize those thoughts.
Oh, are
And
we going to try this word?
well,
We've been practicing.
we love how much you talk about
Gezellig.
Gezelligheid. Gezellig, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
we weren't sure we'd be able to pronounce it in any way that you would feel proud of us.
And
Really?
that was a very gentle correction. So we've been in lots of cross-cultural situations and mess up language great, and everybody has a very different way of correcting us. That was probably the most gentle.
But we love that there are some words that just aren't even translatable in another culture, and so it defines a feeling or
Yeah.
a
How
situation.
would you do that in English? In English.
How would you define gezellig?
Yeah, for an American culture, because we don't have that kind of construct.
No, you don't have the construct. And I think it's, what a construct does, I think, is pay attention to or pull things together in a situation that you do have. I mean, I have
Yes.
told my American friends, this is gezellig. So you're sitting together, probably, it doesn't have to be inside, but there is a winter component, but it's very peaceful. It's very harmonious. It's very close. The situation is relaxed, and you're spending the focus is on the togetherness. I would say, drinking tea and, having cake but it can also be a family dinner that was really harmonious, together, pleasant. I don't know. I would say the main thing about gezellig is that you spend it together. You wouldn't easily say that it's gezellig by yourself. That's not the situation. And then there's a coziness to it. That's probably the closest word.
That's what I love about that word, because the in trying to understand it, you say that the best English equivalent is the word cozy, but to us, if I said to an American what would be cozy, they're usually describing a situation where they're by themselves with a cup of tea and a book or something and a fire. And this word seems to have so much more to do with relational closeness and that
Gezellig is
peaceful feeling.
really primarily relational.
Yeah.
So it has the being snug with your blankets quality, but it would be being snug together with your blankets,
Mhm.
under the same blanket or
Yeah.
watching. You could watch TV, I mean, and be gezellig, but there's a very much a focus on the togetherness.
And a comfortable togetherness, even if it's silence
Comfortable
or if it's,
togetherness. Silence.
no, there should be conversation.
I mean, I could imagine sitting together and reading a book, but it's not the typical gezellig. Gezellig is more a slow kind of interaction. It doesn't have to be anything highbrow, but
Mhm.
yeah, yeah.
So
I do read
we have
gezellig.
we have had a gezellig time with you. The one question that we love to ask our guests is, what have we not asked that's important to know, or that you would ask yourself if you were on the other side of the mic?
Maybe something that there may be two things that I would add. One thing is connected to your question just now, and it is that, it's actually really easy to explain what a word does that we don't know, because, you don't know gezellig, I can tell you, you can probably pull up an image when I say gezellig. You have instances when I say it. I mean, I know from my friends that, I give a few examples and then they misapply it or they miss an instance where it's so the concept, just having a few examples, of course, doesn't give you the whole experience, but
Yeah.
it does give you a direction. But what concepts do is organize experiences. That's really easy to recognize when it's a new concept. What is less easy to recognize is when the concepts are translations. So, how is anger different from the Dutch equivalent, which is not a complete equivalent, namely both sides? And so we've done that, and this is something that I, as a bilingual person or an almost bilingual person, would not be able to articulate. In the sense of ask me how they're different. I probably use them differently. I know that people use those words differently. We know that the society is different, so the instances that people encounter are different. That we know, but it's much harder to if you tell me you're angry, it's much easier for me to apply what I know about both sides, my word for anger, to you, and it may not be true. And this is, of course, there are bigger differences than the ones between Dutch, Belgian people and Americans, and bigger differences than the languages of English and Dutch. And it's something that I think has caused a lot of problem, that you just don't know when somebody says they're angry or they're happy, that they mean exactly the same. And still it works exactly the same. And so that's one thing that I would want myself to say, is that it's not just for those words that are unique, but it's actually for every word, because every concept that we have is basically is a summary of the experiences we have had. And so if you have had different experiences because you've lived in a different family, a different socioeconomic class, a different country,
Yeah.
that concept gets a different meaning. So that's one of the things that I would add.
Yeah, and as a marriage and family therapist, we would say the map is not the territory. You can have a map that guides you, but it's different than being in the environment.
Right, that's true. And we see that, for example, with second language learners, not like me actually, but the ones that learned it in schools. They learned the new words and they apply them in exactly the way that the translated words would be used. So it's only when people move to a country and have the actual encounters in the country that the new words gain the meaning that they have in the new culture. So that's one thing, that when a Ghanese person tells you that they're angry, that may not, you cannot assume that that means what you think angry means, even if translation is that, because it was the closest word.
Yeah.
The other thing that I would say is that, and this is something that is very ingrained in Western culture, is that we have a very strong idea that emotions need to be expressed, and it's Freudian or psychodynamic, but it's really entrenched in the culture we live. When I give examples to teachers in Belgium, I've done that. They say, and I say, that boy, his mom said, "Don't cry. That makes you look ugly." That Taiwanese mom, they say, "Oh, that's horrible." And I say, "What's horrible about it?" And they say, "Well, a child needs to cry." And I say, "Why do you think a child needs to cry?" "Well, what is inside, I mean, we have no evidence that a child needs to cry, just to be sure. But just what's inside has to come out, and this child is going to get frustrated. And we don't know everything there is to know about it. We just know that suppression of emotions, suppression of expression, has a very different effect in cultures that see emotions between people as people who see emotions in people. And so the whole idea that there is an emotion inside you and it's a part of your authentic self, that probably itself gives rise to negative effects of suppression, because you feel like you can't express your authentic self. But if you feel that emotions evolve in the relationship, you're always accommodating your expression and your emotions. That's actually what emotions are. They're getting shaped in the interaction with other people.
Mm.
And so knowing that in this culture, in this context, it's better not to cry doesn't seem to be effortful specifically. It doesn't seem to increase the feelings. It doesn't seem to hurt people. They don't seem to have the negative consequences that we find in Western contexts. So I think the question would be, what does it mean to not express your emotions? And it depends on the context, is what I would say. But also here again, the idea is that until we know what it does for a lot of people, expressing, not expressing, having an emotion, not having an emotion, we also find that the emotions that are bad for your health in Western cultures are not necessarily bad for your health in other cultures.
Mm.
It probably just depends on what the meaning of those emotions are in the culture. So even a lot of the consequences of having and expressing emotions cannot be assumed to be the same. You have to know what that emotion means in the context and in the culture, and what expressing that emotion means in the culture and in the context.
Yeah,
Those
that's
are
such a good point, because we do think if we know the word for that, that's, and Americans, as you say, it's so true. We're obsessed with happiness. We even have it in our Constitution.
yes,
So we can assume everybody else wants to be happy, and that's not necessarily true. But I love the beautiful imagery you have of that as a dance, as somebody coming in thinking they're coming in to do the tango and find there's music for a waltz playing. And so it can be awkward. And I think maybe that's a barrier for some people, is it feels awkward. I'm just going to not be curious or not step into this anymore. But it is a beautiful thing when that's created between people. A
mhm,
dance is created and shaped between how
mhm,
people are moving with each
mhm.
other.
Yeah. So we can. Just a little remark on the Constitution and happiness. There's,
Yes.
there's this colleague of mine, Shige Oshi, who has done research on the use of happiness in the oh, I just had the word and now I don't. When the president addresses Congress for the first,
State of the Union.
yeah, State of
Or
the Union, that's
yeah,
what
yeah.
I was looking for. Yeah, State of the Union. And he finds that only in the 60s, people were starting to use the word happiness as, first of all, as a state of the individual,
Mm,
because before it was used as the state of the nation.
Yeah.
Second of all, there is a shift in the meaning of happiness from not suffering to actually having positive feelings and
mm.
positive things happen to you. So what that constitution means has shifted in over time because the culture has shifted.
It
That is a
has.
very interesting point, that even what we think we know from our own culture and written into our Constitution could be a very different meaning.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I just we could continue on, because I think the comment that you talked about, it depends on the context of right now in the U.S., our culture. If we disagree, kind of to the conflict piece, we're negating the individual's experience rather than kind of trying to form something new in relationship, and that just leans harder into this individual happy, not happy. You have to see things my way, or you're attacking me. Makes a very different and difficult way of doing relationship.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Yeah, I agree. And the assumption of difference and also the acceptance of difference and trying to, I actually listened to an Ezra Klein show where he interviewed Sarah McBride.
Yeah.
And she described, I thought it was really interesting in that she describes that, you don't have to ask that people totally agree with you. You can just see to what point do we agree and where do we differ, and build on what we agree and accept people are not bad people because they see the world in slightly different terms, and you can try to reach consensus on what you consent on. And there's an almost dogmatic approach to politics and interactions these days where you're right or wrong and you're with me or against me, and
Exactly.
you be just with me but disagree. That's
Yes.
that's perfectly possible.
Yeah.
Or think like me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a richness there because that challenges our boundaries, our relational boundaries. There's a quote that was one of our key takeaways. I'm going to steal it from Tara because she wrote down all the quotes, just to be honest.
Yeah.
But it's where you're talking towards the end of the book. I arrived at this point by asking questions about and observing how individuals in cultures interpret what's happening. And this is what we've been talking about. What they want from their relationship and which responses they expect or receive to their emotions. And most important of all, I relinquish my own assumptions of what the right answer is to the questions of what would be. I just love that. I think that was the takeaway for us of epistemic humility, how we enter in, not knowing, and being okay with the messiness of difference, and actually we enjoy a little bit of chaos in our lives, and that's relationship. Of how do you tolerate that?
Yeah. And that is why I highlighted that quote, because that's what we so appreciate about you, is because everything that you've written about and the way you talk about this is such a bridge to human connection. It's such an invitation for us to just come in with curiosity to each other, to appreciate the different experiences that we all bring. And that's what makes a better world.
Yeah, maybe I should also say that if it sounds too much like a fairy tale, it's not like I'm always succeeding in that.
Yeah.
I have a lot of examples in the book where I went in and I just denied at first what my Japanese collaborators or my Turkish collaborators told me. I just thought that can't be true. So it's not that I always live up to the ideal. And one of the things that we find in research is that we don't find it specifically for emotions, but we do find it for bridging differences, is that accepting that mistakes are made, that it's a process that you work on, and that you can also forgive that people make mistakes, that you can come back and explain it once more or say no. But also for yourself that, not every failure means that you'll never get it. It probably means that you need more interaction. It doesn't mean that you never get it.
Yeah.
I think it's important to have that realism because
Yeah.
it's not, if I'm talking about my own family or my own marriage or my own, colleagues that I see day to day, it's not that we always get each other. It's the openness to keep trying that makes for worthwhile relationships. And that is no different when you try to bridge different cultures or different perspectives than when you try to bridge any kind of relationships. It's work. It's work, man.
Yes.
It's hard
Oh
work.
man, that's not the takeaway we wanted. We wanted just like the answer,
Oh,
and then we don't have to do
yeah.
anything else.
No, I often say, I talk to companies or businesses and to schools, and I say, I do not have the magic wand for you. As much as you would
Yeah.
like to come in and write you a prescription, that's not how it works because that's not how relationships work.
Right.
But
Yes, but I
do
think you spoke to what we think is the magic wand, is that it will be painful, we will make mistakes, and yet we keep trying. right?
Yeah. Yeah. There's no replacements for connecting. I mean, connecting is a verb,
Yeah.
and there's no shortcut for it. But it does give you connection in the end. So it's, or more connection.
It gives you that Zelig feeling.
Yes, and thank you so much for taking the time to connect with us. We're so grateful that you spent the time answering our questions and adding more information that we never thought of to ask.
It was delightful to talk to you.
Thank you.